Okay, we'll call our meeting to order.
Question à vous poser. Est-ce que vous avez la
Do you have, I have a question. Do you have the list of future witnesses?
To you, okay.
S'il vous plaît. Merci.
Okay, certainly. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today, Mr. Buda and Mr. Thompson from Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and Mr. Dishkima. Did I pronounce that right? And from Cardis. And Mr. Buda or Mr. Thompson, 10 minutes or less, please.
For sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly thank you to all of us for having you here today. Actually, I just bring regrets from Mayor Doug Graycraft of Southwest Middlesex, who's actually supposed to be here with me today. He got hung up waiting for a muchly delayed plane, so he's not able to be here, but he does bring his greetings, and certainly I bring our greetings from our president, Councillor Karen Ludovici of Edmonton. And we always welcome the opportunity to speak on these issues with this committee. So on behalf of FCM's 2,000 members, I'm really pleased to share our views on the topic of how competition can make infrastructure dollars go further. At FCM, we believe there's no sure way to create jobs today and strengthen our economic foundations of tomorrow than investing in municipal infrastructure. Where federal, provincial, territorial, private, and local partners bring funding and expertise to the table, no other investment, we believe, goes as far or achieves so much. In a world of economic uncertainty, we believe Canadians want to know that we're taking action to build the conditions for a competitive economy and strong communities. And Canadians want to know that all orders of government are working together to make progress in practical priorities like good roads, clean water, shorter commute. The new infrastructure plan, announced in Budget 2013, is set to renew federal funding expiring in 2014. It'll index the gas tax fund to protect its long-term value, commits to longer-term funding program for projects, and certainly we believe a step in the right direction. Particularly by protecting the purchasing power of the gas tax transfer and extending program funding for 10 years, the budget advances the principle of longer-term sustainable infrastructure funding, which is going to be a real theme of my comments today, and I think it really responds to the question asked by this committee. We're particularly pleased with the government's decision to review the effectiveness of its infrastructure plan within 5 years. This will be a real opportunity, we think, to take stock of how effectively the plan is addressing key infrastructure gaps, notably in public transit and upgrades required as a result of new federal wastewater regulations. And again, speaking to the question raised by this committee, it will be an opportunity to review the policies and procedures and rules and regulations that are set into the program initially to ensure that every dollar is being stretched as far as it can, that we're maximizing the value of every federal dollar to taxpayers. So on the specific question this committee is studying, we have the following comments. As members will know, Canadian municipalities own and operate a little bit more than 60% of Canada's core economic infrastructure, but collect just 8 cents of every tax dollar paid in Canada. And cities and communities are always open to innovative ideas to help address this critical gap. So I want to start on the first subject around streamlining programs and reducing red tape. And I want to start by saying that one of the best and surest ways to reduce red tape and increase private sector infrastructure involvement, which means increasing competition and ensuring fairness, is through predictable infrastructure investments like the gas tax fund, rather than lottery-style investments through application-based funds. So let me explain why. So application-based funding programs like the Building Canada Fund are very well suited to building large-scale projects with exceptionally high upfront capital costs. They leverage matching investments by all orders of government on a one-time basis to meet strategic priorities, often of regional or even national significance. And so they're definitely useful in some circumstances, but they can actually make the infrastructure deficit worse unless they're balanced with predictable funding programs that enable communities to maintain or repair existing infrastructure. So, in fact, the combination of the Building Canada Fund is an application-based program, and the Gas Tax Fund really does provide that balance. But nevertheless, there's ways to improve these application-based funding programs. In the short term, setting clear priorities and ensuring a significant portion goes to municipally owned projects will improve the predictability of the fund for local governments, which is going to help them improve their own planning, and most critically, it'll improve the ability of the private sector, the providers of construction and other type services to municipalities, to adapt their own supply and resources and capacity to the demands needed, which will almost certainly increase competition locally. Looking at permanently adopting the Economic Action Plan, streamline application forms and processes, but also enhance the Building Canada Fund by reducing the amount of time between a project's application and its approval. Again, this by shortening approval times, increasing the predictability of when a project will begin, it'll encourage more and more private sector companies to bid for projects. So moving on to the second topic around the increasing private sector investments and participation in local projects. FCM views P3s as one tool to consider when assessing projects, but it's important to remember they're not a magic bullet and cannot address our infrastructure needs alone. And while P3s are an important tool available to municipalities to increase their financing options, whether or not to pursue a P3 option is a decision that we believe must be made at the local level. Now, the newly announced Building Canada Fund contains a so-called P3 screen, which will ensure that certain applications must consider P3 as a condition of applying for funding for projects of over $100 million. And it's certainly something that that's a provision we certainly support as a means to ensuring that a P3 is considered rather than forced. It is important to remember that in rural Canada especially, P3s really aren't that effective because of the large-scale project scale required. So in fact, most of our research and what we've heard from the private sector suggests that a project value of $100 million or more is really required as a minimum floor for making a P3 project work, and most rural and remote, even small town communities really don't have projects of that size. And they also have challenges around capacity and in terms of assessing and managing a P3 project, and even simply accessing the information required to get RFPs out. And just as a note, since 2007, only 40% or only 60% of the P3 fund has been allocated. So 715 million out of 1.25 billion of the P3 fund. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was the procurement process that municipalities follow, and that I think that's most directly related to the questions of this committee. An important aspect of ensuring job creation and increasing bids for projects at the municipal level, as I said before, is stable and predictable funding in the long term to allow municipalities and the private sector to better plan their investment when it comes to infrastructure and jobs. So FCM was really pleased with the additional flexibility added to the eligible project categories in the Gas Tax Fund, for example, to allow for diversification and meeting the most pressing needs. And on its own, this measure will create more opportunities for competition locally. As an example or an anecdote, we've spoken to several municipalities who, for the last few years, up until 2 or 3 years ago, had trouble attracting more than one bid to an RFP for a local project. And that was mainly because they just simply weren't putting enough RFPs out. They didn't have enough money to spend, essentially, on infrastructure to attract enough, essentially, local competition for their projects. And they've related that over the last few years, the leadership really shown by the federal government in reinvesting in Canada's infrastructure, which has increased not just the amount of money that's being put in infrastructure every year, but the sense, especially in the private sector, that interest in investing in infrastructure and the continued investment in infrastructure over the longer term has attracted more and more private sector bidders. So in small communities, we've heard many examples where people have said, for years we only had one bid, now we're getting 2, 3, or even 4 bids, because companies know that we're going to be investing in our local infrastructure, not just this year, but next year, but for the long term. And that, of course, multiple bids is the very, very best way, actually, of reducing your costs locally. I think on this score, too, I want to mention that municipal procurement processes are regulated by provincial agreements or legislation. In some cases, they create those provincial regulations create conditions where these types of decisions are outside of the control of local governments. I want to underscore that any increased federal restrictions on municipal tendering will simply add red tape, additional bureaucratic hurdles, and ultimately delays and added costs to building core infrastructure and creating jobs for Canadians. So I guess in conclusion, our hope is that the long-term plan announced in Budget 2013 can provide all governments with a model for common sense cooperation and help tear down the silos that prevent them from delivering the very best value for taxpayers. The infrastructure plan that was announced in the budget is an important opportunity for Canada to maximize, and municipal leaders are ready to do their part, and we're pleased to take any questions on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buda, and we'll now move to Mr. Dishkima for 10 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. It's Brian Dykema.
Dykema?
It's all right.
My apologies.
Your apology accepted. So good afternoon. Thanks very much for having me here. I would like to congratulate the committee for doing this work. I think it's very important work, and I'd also like to extend my gratitude for your work in Parliament on all fronts. My name is Brian Dykema. I'm Program Director for the Work and Economics Research Project at CARDIS, which is a think tank. And we're a public policy think tank that has a long history of studying construction and the role of labor, and particularly in construction. And out of that research, I'd like to make two basic points with my time today. The first is that open tendering and closed tendering should not be considered equivalent to non-union and union construction. The sector is much more complex than that. The realities on the ground are much more complex than that strict binary presented by many people. Second is that the competitiveness and the health of the construction industry depend on an open and fair tendering process, not only for democratic reasons, because it's a basic democratic issue, but for economic innovation in a sector that Canada is increasingly relying upon, both for infrastructure in municipalities and across the country, but also for other reasons like responsible resource development. On the first point, CARDIS has several research publications charting the construction industry in Canada's economy from the 70s to the present. One of the most profound changes during that time is the changing face of the way labor has interacted with construction owners and purchasers and buyers. The construction industry labor force is unique because the large-scale projects involved in infrastructure especially create cyclical demands for a highly skilled workforce. There was a time when only one type of union, the traditional building trades unions, the craft unions, were able to provide and manage those labor cycles and demands. Today, that is no longer true. Today, a variety of labor pools exist and work effectively in the industry across the country in most places. Many Canadian jurisdictions now have a competitive labor pool on the ground, but public policy has not yet developed to recognize this reality. In 2003, we produced a paper called Competitively Working in Tomorrow's Construction that noted the diverse character of the workforce. Far from construction being neatly divided between union and non-union shops, we noted that there are at least seven different ways to organize the construction workforce. There was, of course, the traditional building craft union, building trades craft union. There were unions that had multiple crafts within one building trades union. There were craft unions which had expanded jurisdictions via multi-skilled tradespersons. There was the movement of maintenance unions into construction work. There was the development of industrial unions such as the CEP taking on construction work, so industrial unions taking on construction work that had not traditionally been part of their jurisdiction. The development of alternative unions such as CLAC and others, and of course various unions organizing under project agreements. The binary presumption that work in construction is either union or non-union is not an accurate portrayal of what's going on the ground in the construction sector. This is an important shift, and these different organizing models, these ways of organizing the workforce, and how they adapt to openness or restrictions across the spectrum will define how this industry succeeds or fails in the medium term. In 2005, CARDIS organized a Stepping Forward conference in Calgary, which brought together the full range of employer and labor organizations involved in this sector. The conference was co-sponsored by the building trades, by Merit, by CLAC, by the CLRA, and PCAC, all of whom came together to discuss the various challenges facing the industry and the sector. The conference and report addressed a range of issues including labour supply, apprenticeship training, and quality of life as it applied to working models in the sector. It's important to note that not only is there diversity within the sector itself in the construction workforce, but that the construction workforce and therefore the construction sector is increasingly national in scope. We conducted two studies for the Construction Sector Council called Working Mobile and Working Local, in which we surveyed construction workers regarding the motivations and obstacles that they faced working in different jurisdictions. For instance, Newfoundlanders working in Fort McMurray or something along those sorts, and why they made those choices and some of the obstacles to that, benefits and drawbacks for the sector. It became clear that there are a variety of barriers for workers to move across jurisdictions. We've dealt with that elsewhere too. In 2008, at a presentation at the Economic Club of Canada, my colleague Ray Pennings highlighted some of the economic dimensions of the challenge posed by the gap between policy and realities on the ground. The paper, entitled "Why is Construction So Expensive in Ontario?" highlighted the fact that Ontario's labour relations regime has virtually ignored the development of new models of organizing labour which are more prevalent in Western Canada and are increasingly prevalent in other places in the country. And this leads to my second point. In Ontario, but also across the country, I want to note, closed tendering practices are a key example of the lag between policy and the reality on the ground. Canada's construction organizing laws need to catch up to the better options available today, or at least the multiple options available today. This will greatly help our economy as public procurement budgets rise and as more and more money is needed, as my colleagues pointed out here. But it will also bolster our democracy as Canadian workers are looking for freedom of choice that moves beyond the choices offered to them in the past. Economically speaking, our CARDIS Competitiveness Monitor, Construction Competitiveness Monitor, has found that restrictive bidding adds up to a surcharge for public purchasers ranging from 2%, if you accept the model used by the City of Toronto and most frequently cited by representatives of those who tend to be beneficiaries of restricted bidding, i.e. the building trades unions, to the City of Hamilton's estimate of 40%, which was provided to it by consultants and also confirmed in the City's report on the issue of closed tendering when it became subject to closed tendering. Stephen Bald, who has authored legal texts on public procurement produced by LexisNexis, suggests that not only is the matter relevant in terms of who is eligible to bid and the cost structures under which they operate, but that the number of bidders itself has an impact on the price. Bald's research and much other research by economists suggests that the cost decreases range from 20 to 25% as the number of bidders rise from 2 to 15. Bald suggests 3 reasons for greater competition in construction bidding, and I quote here. First, as the number of bidders increases, each participant in the process has an incentive to offer a better price, because it becomes harder for bidders participating in the process to anticipate each other's behavior. Second, a higher number of bids can increase the chance of receiving a bid from a party who will place a high value on securing the contract. Such a party is more likely to offer a competitive price. Third, an increase in the number of bids makes it more difficult for the bidders to organize on a collusive basis. In short, closed bidding costs our public budgets immensely. But there's a more fundamental argument, which is a democratic one. Disqualifying potential bidders from public works because of choices they make or workers make as private citizens runs contrary to Canadian principles. Closed tendering not only costs taxpayers more money, but it embeds one particular labor model to the detriment of other workers' organizations and to the detriment of workers' choice. In short, it squelches the tremendous innovation and diversity taking place within the sector on the ground. Workers should be free to choose between these competing models of labor organizations without being arbitrarily disqualified from public works because of their choice as private citizens. The public should also be able to benefit from the innovations that are taking place by these competitive pools by seeing the full range of qualified labor models competing for public work paid for by public dollars. There's an ancient principle of governance that says that which touches all must be approved by all. I would suggest to this committee and to the government that a similar principle should be applied to tendering of publicly funded infrastructure projects. That which is funded by all should be accessible to all. In other words, open tendering is about fairness. In a free and democratic society, there should be no restrictions which limit otherwise qualified companies from bidding on publicly funded work because of the private affiliation of their employees. It's simply not fair. I submit to this committee that the onus should not be placed on those asking for public tenders to be open to all Canadians, but the onus should be on those who wish to close public tenders to a select group, whoever that group might be. What public policy goal is served when bidding is restricted? I've not yet found out. And this is not simply a municipal or provincial issue, it's a national issue. Significant amounts of federal funding are subject to closed bidding, including $263 million in Ontario alone, according to our review of federal infrastructure expenditures. Union Station in Toronto, most of us have had a chance to visit that, and the Pan Am Games Stadium in Hamilton, my town, are two of the more high-profile examples of federal funding or federal funds being restricted. In Manitoba, the Red River Floodway Expansion Project and the East Side Road Project are subject to project labor agreements with certain unions, which effectively bar companies affiliated with other unions and non-union companies from bidding on public infrastructure projects under the labor relations model chosen by their employees. These projects have received $324 million of federal funding, and a significant portion of this work has been subject to restrictive project agreements. So it is a national issue. British Columbia, too, is their law is structured in a manner that allows restricted worker choice and reduced competition. Unions there, whatever union or any group, may apply to the minister for the right to bargain collectively and enter into project collective agreements for the duration of major projects. This effectively allows a given union or labor pool to petition the minister for exclusive rights on major projects. This politicizes public works in unhelpful ways. We recognize that there are significant interests at play in this discussion. My colleague Ray Pennings noted in our 2003 Working Competitively paper that given the significant dollars, organizational reputations, and market shares at stake for the various companies, unions, and associations involved in Canadian industrial construction, sorting through the spin is an inevitable necessity for any publicly held discussion of labor relations and the role of infrastructure funding. Governments have a significant task to sort through this spin and recognize that open tendering is a strategic concern for the country. It is connected to the heart of the country's jobs and training program, a program that has been laid out by this government. It will help engage diverse communities such as Aboriginals, and open tendering will assist responsible resource extraction, and it will ensure that Canada's infrastructure deficit is brought back to surplus in an affordable and fair manner, combined with increased funding. This is a question of whether we're going to live up to our reputation as a country which recognizes diversity and encourages innovation and promotes excellence. As such, we have three recommendations. The first is that a study be commissioned to examine the cost savings which the federal government stands to gain from open tendering or making open tendering a requirement. Second, that the government make reception of federal infrastructure funds conditional on opening public tenders to all qualified bidders, regardless of the labor affiliation of their employees, except in jurisdictions which are prevented by provincial law from doing so. So places where it's a voluntary signing on to a project labor agreement which would close bidders out should not receive federal funding. Jurisdictions which are currently handcuffed by that because of provincial labor law should still be eligible. And third, that the government initiate meetings with provincial counterparts to determine ways to ensure fair, open and transparent bidding on projects receiving federal funds, with a particular emphasis on removing barriers to multiple labor pools. Thanks for your attention. I welcome your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll now move to questioning Ms. Cho, 7 minutes.
Yep, thank you. The question is to the Federation of Canadian Municipality. FCM has asked for dedicated funding. That didn't happen. We're still into the grant lottery situation because you requested a $2.5 billion direct transfer. And then the gas tax has been indexed, but because of the 100 million incrementals, municipalities won't be seeing the first nickel until 2016. Having said that, my question is very specific, that the Obama team did a red tape reduction initiative, and they managed to half the time that it now takes them to approve an application. And there are examples where I believe the Z Bridge replacement was cut by, the approval process was cut by 3 years, I believe. And another project was cut by 6 months. And since they have, that one was the Red Line Rail Transit Corridor, was cut by 6 months. It looks like what they're doing is they're looking at the best practices from all the different applications and municipalities. They have a very sophisticated IT tracking system, and they were able to reduce the approval time by at least 50%. Is that something that the FCM have been pushing for, that you'd be interested in the federal government going towards this direction?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Well, certainly, you know, one of FCM's interests in working with the federal government, the design of the new programs, is to really take the best of what we learned in the Economic Action Plan and apply those lessons in the new program. So that essentially means reducing approval times to as limited as possible, at the same time as allowing for sufficient review, simplifying application forms. And the best way to accomplish that is to focus the federal government's accountability mechanisms built into the new plans on ensuring that there's value for money in the outcomes produced by those investments. So rather than focusing on the inputs, on what kind of concrete to use or what shape the bridge should be, or procurement rules, the government should be ensuring and testing and auditing that every dollar that it invests through municipalities and local infrastructure is used as efficiently as possible. And the best way to do that is to look at outcomes, not on inputs. And so that means identifying clear priorities for the programs, improving the predictability of the funds, and making sure that approval processes at provincial, territorial, and federal levels are really transparent, and then tracking everything, so as mentioned. So certainly what's happening in the States is laudable, although I should mention that I think the federal government has learned a tremendous amount over the last decade, and in fact, Canada is still well ahead of where the United States is, but that doesn't mean we can rest on our laurels. We've got to keep going because they're catching up, and the more efficient we can make our programs, the more streamlined we can make their programs, the more attractive it will be for the private sector to bid on and participate in projects here.
Do you support the federal government putting conditions on funds? I know that you prefer the gas tax, which is a direct transfer, but in terms of the grant program that just got reannounced, would you prefer to see various conditions attached to it? Because I've always heard from my friends on the other side that they want the local municipality to have the full autonomy to make their own decisions, because planning and local municipalities really have direct say. But I noticed that they're now drifting towards applying conditions, whether it's P3 screenings or whatever other conditions might get applied. Is that something you support?
Well, obviously, the Building Canada Fund is a three-way. It's intended to be a three-way cost-shared program, which means there's really, I mean, in our view, there's three partners involved, and so, you know, I think our members would say it's absolutely fair for each partner to ensure that its own accountability is met through various restrictions or limits or strings or whatever you want to call them. So we certainly understand there needs to be restrictions. The federal government has its own objectives that it needs to ensure are met, but that we would we think that the money will be best spent if we try to minimize and limit the restrictions that are placed in the funds by each order of government only to those that will maximize the outcomes that the investments will bring. In other words, trying to do too much using regulation is really just another word for adding red tape. That let's focus on maximizing outcomes and then holding every order of government accountable for doing so. So that means adding anytime a process is added to an approval process, for instance, for a new program, we need to make sure that that's going to produce outcomes greater than the costs of actually carrying out or meeting those restrictions. And so it really comes down to cost-benefit analysis.
The Parliamentary Budget Officer reported out 2 weeks ago that for the next 2 years, there is in fact a reduction of the amount up to $2 billion of infrastructure fund per year that will be used for the municipality. Is that also your analysis?
Not entirely. This is a slightly complex issue in that the budget reports on the funds that leave Ottawa and are sent to the project partner, in our case, municipalities. But the way that the federal government administers its application-based programs, it doesn't actually send the check to the receiving municipality until a receipt is actually submitted, an original receipt actually, here in Ottawa from the municipality. Municipalities typically don't actually pay off their contractors until the project has received final approval, which includes after final engineering assessments. It could be 3 years after the project is finished. What it means is there's a massive delay between when a project is approved and when money leaves Ottawa. And indeed, you'll see that in the budget, there's $6 billion in funds that have been reprofiled from programs that go back all the way to 2004. So to our mind, the budget profile that's seen in the budget isn't as important as how the program is developed and designed, and that'll happen in the next 6 or 8 months, which will give an indication as to the pace of project approvals that the government will be following. And our expectation is, and our position is that the new Building Canada plan should be maintaining investments roughly at the average, if not more so, than the past 7 years, which is $1.25 billion. The new program allows for about $1.4 billion on average over the next 10 years. So it'll be really important to as we move through the first few years, to see that project approvals are maintaining that pace.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. St. Denis. 7 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. You said that the federal government should not impose too many restrictive policies, but what do you say with respect to cost overruns? There are, when we see that costs are always 2 times higher than expected, what solution do you see to deal with this problem of cost overruns?
Thanks for the question. To clarify, a cost overrun on a 3-way cost-shared project through the Building Canada Fund, for example, 100% of the cost overrun will be borne by the municipal government. So even if the cost overrun is a result of delays in approving the project, so between when an application is submitted with a cost estimate of the project's cost and when the project is approved, sometimes those delays can be 2 or 3 years, and of course, over that time, construction costs increase because of inflation and the rest. 100% of those cost overruns are borne by the municipality. So for cost share programs like the Building Canada Fund, there's a tremendous amount of accountability on the municipality to stick to the budget required, because they're not going to get a dollar more from the federal or provincial government than was promised originally. So in that regard, there's really not a lot of room or need for restrictions around that, because the cost overruns are borne by the federal government. Of course, if the project comes in under budget, the federal contribution is in fact scaled back. So it's a kind of a ratchet effect. If the costs go up, it's a municipal responsibility. If the costs go down, the savings are shared amongst all 3 partners. I hope that answers your question.
Merci. Monsieur Dijema, vous parlez des
Mr. You were talking about unemployed and unemployed projects, Mr. Dijema, unionized and non-unionized projects. Would you say that there's a difference between that unionized employees or non-unionized employees are better? Why do you say that if people were not unionized, things would be better?
We never said that if people were not unionized that things would be better. What I said was that there are a variety of ways of organizing labor, including new unions and various ways of organizing even unionized workforces. And so what I said was that it was not fair to restrict bidding to only one type of the 7 options available. So as I said at the very beginning, this is not a question of union versus non-union. It's very clear that unionized contractors do very fine work and do good work and build it well in this country. It's also very clear that non-unionized companies do the same. It's also very clear that companies whose workers affiliated with different ways of unionizing do work, and that's demonstrated on the ground across the country. Various ways of organizing labor do good work, so it's not a question of union versus non.
Alors, vous avez dit que les gens devaient...
You have said that people should be using new models, adopt new models of organization. Can you give us examples of projects carried out under 3P arrangements that gave better results, where the infrastructure would last longer, for example, than infrastructure projects that were carried out without the P3 model?
Again, and I'm sorry if I'm not being clear, but it's not a matter of using P3s or using traditional procurement methods. Our concern as a think tank is to ensure that the variety of ways in which Canadian workers choose to organize themselves on the ground in the construction workforce, whether that's in publicly procured projects without P3s or with P3s, that they are able to bid and to work on projects that their tax dollars pay for. So there are many examples of P3s that work well. There are examples of P3s that don't work well. And there are P3s that use unionized labor of the traditional building craft. There are P3s that use other labor. What we're saying is that the realities on the ground in terms of the way workers organize themselves has changed from the time that the laws that were originally set up to do. And so what needs to happen is that policy needs to recognize that there's a spectrum of ways in which workers choose to organize themselves, and that those workers should not be disqualified from working on projects that their tax dollars pay for. So it's not a question of P3s or not. We're not taking a position on P3s here. It's simply a question of whether or not publicly funded projects should be available to the full spectrum of Canadians who pay for it.
Okay.
You still have a minute and a half.
Il me reste encore 1 minute et demie.
I have a minute and a half. The problems of excess billing, how can you control that? Or inflated billing? You have said that the rules should sort of be changed, because we're talking only at the federal level, that a large part of the financing of construction programs is provincial and municipal. But if there are no rules, you said that the rules should be abolished. There are too many rules, it's too complicated, it takes too much time. How will you deal with the problem of excess billing and collusion? I come from a province where it's obvious that exists. What sort of solution do you see? Has everything been done in my province? For example, P3s, union rules. There were rules at all levels, but how do you see that we can decrease collusion, in your opinion? Particularly if you want to reduce the rules.
Directed to me? Yeah. Again, we're not suggesting that the rules for procurement need to be reduced per se, although I'd like to see rules that are efficient and provide the best value for tax dollars. Our concern is that closing tendering to one particular party or one particular organization is a recipe for collusion, and that economic analysis suggests that as you restrict bidding, the chances of collusion rise. The OECD has a number of papers put out on that. It's a fairly well-established economic reality that as you reduce the pool of competitive bidders, the chances of collusion increase. And so in the situation in Quebec, It's very unique in the sense that they do have choice among unions.
Sûr.
Oui.
Je suis pas certaine.
Oui, c'est vrai. But that choice, again, there's six choices, and that's it. And so it's very easy for those groups to collude. And you don't actually have a non-union choice in Quebec. Not that I'm particularly in favor of that over others, but I would encourage a wide variety, a wide spectrum, and that full spectrum should be able to bid. It's simply, as I said, I've not yet heard a good argument that would suggest that certain Canadians, because of choices they make as private citizens, should be barred from working on projects that their tax dollars pay for. So we think that competition, especially amongst labor pools and therefore companies, is a good tool for reducing costs, but also reducing collusion.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Poilievre.
Point of order. Can I just read on the record a quick motion that the TRAN committee invites the Minister of Transport to defend the supplementary estimate A, and the committee study this estimate prior to 3 sitting days before June 18, 2013. Thank you.
Okay, that was to be next meeting with 48 hours notice, but...
I'm not moving anything.
Okay.
Just put it in order.
Okay. Mr. Poilievre?
Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Buda, municipalities have been very successful in augmenting their revenues over the last 2 decades, and the last decade in particular. Between 2001 and 2011, municipal revenues grew by 71%, while inflation and population growth totaled 30%. In other words, revenues to municipalities have been growing at twice the pace of the need. So I think it's fair to say that taxpayers are funding municipalities adequately, and that the revenue issue is now completely resolved. The question then becomes, why is there still a shortfall in funding, in the municipality's ability to keep infrastructure up to speed? And that is that question has prompted this study. We have found one of the reasons could be an absence of competition for projects. I'd like to know if your organization has a position on the issue of closed tendering. That is to say, policies that ban workers, union-free workers, from participating in infrastructure projects in certain jurisdictions.
We certainly don't have a position specific to that question. I think when we looked at the question that this committee had forwarded, how to improve competition within the infrastructure sector, we had identified other areas that would in fact increase competition, improve the outcomes of those investments. But just to note on your revenue data, certainly I think we'll have to put our heads together and look at the discrepancies. Our own data that comes from Statistics Canada shows that between 1988 and 2008, municipal own source revenues, which mainly are the property tax, have only increased 1.5%, while at the same time transfers from other governments have decreased 22%. So, I mean, the notion that municipal revenues are galloping ahead doesn't seem to be supported the data we've got, but we're certainly open to seeing other data.
Well, I do have the data here, and it is the total revenues, which is really the only number that matters. It does come from Stats Canada, and it does show that between 2001 and 2011, municipal revenues have grown by more than twice the rate of inflation and population growth combined. And I'd be very pleased to share this data with you as well. On the issue, though, of closed tendering, we have, for example, a case in Hamilton where, and if I quote Peter Sean Taylor, who is an editor-at-large of Maclean's magazine, quote, eligible bidders for construction contracts in Hamilton were reduced by over 90%. Of the 260 firms that had previously bid on city jobs, city staff calculated that only 17 were affiliated with the Carpenters Union. The article goes on to point out estimates of increases between 20 and 40% for projects in Hamilton as a result. A similar problem is now emerging in Kitchener-Waterloo. The FCM has been concerned about municipalities, the difficulty municipalities have in funding their infrastructure. Why has the FCM not spoken out against this unnecessary price inflation that provincial policies are imposing on municipal governments?
Well, certainly we'd. I mean, if you were to ask us, should this committee or Infrastructure Canada carry out a more thorough research related to how closed tendering is driving infrastructure costs, we'd absolutely support that.
That's what we're doing right now.
So the research that we've undertaken has only uncovered very, very anecdotal evidence. So certainly the cases in Hamilton and Kitchener, do appear that require further research. Having said that, it does appear that these are a result of provincial regulations that have been in place for almost 20 years now. So I think when it comes to defining the federal role in solving this, I guess when it goes back to my point earlier that we need to look at ensuring that these new programs are designed so they're as streamlined as possible and attacking the areas where the federal government has the greatest impact. And I'd be concerned that adding federal regulations to address an area that perhaps might only be an issue in one province is going to be a bit of overkill, and we'll end up having all sorts of unintended consequences elsewhere. So, for example, the City of Montreal has a closed tendering rule in place right now, and it's specific to preventing construction companies named in the Charbonneau Commission from bidding for their projects. I would be worried that federal rules that usually come with one-size-fits-all approaches and that can be quite cumbersome and time-consuming are going to end up having these kind of unintended consequences, preventing a very common-sense application of closed tendering. But we certainly, as I said, there doesn't appear to be a lot of thorough data on this question. And indeed, if with more thorough research it's proven to be widespread, it does make sense for the federal government to ensure that value for money is being maximized. But thus far, we've seen no evidence of that.
Right. Well, there is evidence. The municipality of Hamilton has actually issued a report indicating the costs are between 20 and 40%. There are similar estimates for Waterloo, but presumably the FCM, if it were interested in keeping costs down for its members, would oppose this kind of practice and its imposition by another level of government. The FCM does comment on the policies of higher orders of government all the time, so it would not be unusual for it to do so in a case like this one. I'd like to ask Mr. I'm sorry, your name pronunciation again?
Dykema. Forget the
Dykema. Yeah. Are you aware of any data on the cost inflation related to closed tendering?
Yeah, well, in fact, our work has done a survey of the various estimates that are out there. And so those estimates range from, as I said, from 2 to 40%. And if you look at the City of Hamilton report, on one particular project, the estimate of increase, the low bid for this project was 83% higher than the city's budget. And so the facts are actually quite clear. Economists suggest that reducing competition increases prices. All of the evidence presented to us by cities, staffers who I presume are quite competent, otherwise they wouldn't be there. Nobody suggests that costs decrease because of closed bidding. In fact, even the beneficiaries of closed tendering suggest that costs increase. So I would suggest that, again, I've yet to hear why this is of benefit to taxpayers, why this is of benefit to governments, why this is a benefit to Canadians at all. The data shows otherwise.
Do you have specific data linking reduced competition to increased collusion?
Yes, there are a number of papers. The OECD has a number of papers on that.
Those with us?
Yeah, I can certainly find those and pass those along to you.
Okay. Can we get those to the analyst for the report?
Yes, you'll get them.
I'll have to go through my files, but
No,
I can.
That's fair enough.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I do have some questions for Mr. Buda initially. In an ideal world, what is your solution to what you perceive as the underfunding of Canadian municipalities?
For sure, thank you. In fact, our submission to Budget 2013 outlined what we believe is, our prescription for that. The principles are pretty simple. One is we need to improve the ability of municipalities to plan their infrastructure in the long term, and the best way to do that is to actually marry the funding provided from other orders of government with that long-term nature. So increasing the time horizons of federal infrastructure investments massively increases the predictability of those funds, which improves planning. So in fact, that's what the Economic Action Plan 2013 did. It increased the Building Canada plan term from 7 years to 10 years. The 7 years, which is the current Building Canada plan, was also the longest term time horizon. So that alone reduces costs, increases competition, without actually increasing annual investment. So it's a good, great value for money proposition. So it's long-term funding and predictable funding are the most important ones. And then ensuring that you're balancing, as I said in my remarks, investments in new infrastructures with infrastructure with maintaining your existing infrastructure. It's always a really difficult balance municipalities face when you're faced with fiscal constraints. On the operating side, you need to keep the water running. You need to keep the streets plowed. You have to balance your operating budget by law. If your finances are such that becomes a challenge, you end up underinvesting in rehabilitation, which of course ends up costing you manyfold down the line. It's the adage: if you don't fix it, you fix a pothole for $1, or you can fix a major structural repair on the road for $2,000. So the program, in fact, Economic Action Plan 2013 actually achieves that balance with the gas tax fund, including the index. It's been permanent, as well as the application-based funds like the Building Canada Fund. And then third is, as I mentioned earlier, really being clear as to what the objectives of each order of government's investments are, and then tying reporting to those objectives so we can actually mark progress. So in fact, FCM worked with 3 other organizations to develop an infrastructure report card, which really sought to evaluate the current condition of infrastructure. And our plan is to repeat that infrastructure report card every 3 years or so that all Canadians can see the progress that all governments are making towards improving infrastructure, and then hold all of us accountable for that progress or lack thereof.
Well, it seems to me then that we have, in essence, sort of lived up to our end of the bargain. Would you say, therefore, that municipalities have to share some of the blame too? I mean, we've given the municipalities, we've given them long-term funding, long-term predictable funding. There's only one taxpayer at the end of the day. And do you not agree that municipalities need to share some part of the responsibility, that perhaps, they're just not spending their money as wisely as they should be?
I'm not sure I work for them, so I'm not sure I'd agree with that, but for some specific reasons. First of all, up until just a couple of years ago, municipalities spent 90% of what Canada spends on municipal infrastructure in the country, the rest coming from provincial and federal governments. So up until very recently, the federal government was a welcome but a fairly minor player. Now that picture has changed significantly in the last 2 or 3 years, especially with Budget 2013. So the federal government's role in local infrastructure is actually quite significant now, but it's a very recent one, and it comes in the heels of about 30 years of underinvestment and disinvestment by all orders of government, including municipal orders of government. So we've never suggested that municipal governments don't have, if we want to point fingers, they definitely deserve to have their fingers pointed to. But the reality is the problem has roots in 30 years of disinvestment by all orders of government, and if as a country we agree that this core local infrastructure is in fact a foundation of our economic growth, we can either choose to point fingers and lay blame or work together to solve the problem. And while we put the plans in place to solve that problem, we obviously have to make sure that we're not creating new ones down the road, and we're holding governments to account so that the problem doesn't reoccur. So we believe that's happening, but it's not a short-term solution, and the investment levels that are currently being invested are making up lost ground, but there's definitely not. I mean, as our reaction to the budget showed, we think it's a really important foundation, and it's going to the light at the end of the tunnel is there, but we still have a ways to go.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And so we have increased, we're reversing a 30-year trend here So we are moving in the right direction. So we're reversing 30 years of neglect in a lot of instances. So we're doing the right thing. We're interested in outcomes, and in terms of getting the proper outcomes, is it not wise to look at perhaps solutions that we haven't looked at in the past? And one of those solutions has been offered in some of our previous sessions from Merit Canada and Cardis today, that perhaps we should be looking at utilizing labor that is not unionized, because municipalities may be getting better outcomes as a result of it. Is that not something that municipalities should be encouraged to do?
Absolutely. I think the question is how big of a problem is it, and is the size of that problem large enough to offset the costs of trying to solve that problem? So by Cardis's own research, in the province, Ontario, which seems to have the most significant challenge in this regard, 91% of Ontario municipalities follow open tendering for those projects that make up 70% of the population. So is that 100%? Obviously not. What is the cost of getting to 100? And then I guess the last thing I'd say to that is, of course, it sounds like Ontario has got the most significant challenges, partly as a result of provincial rules. Does it make sense for the federal government to solve a problem which appears to be more localized in one province or region that will, as I said, have unintended consequences elsewhere, and add delay and red tape to federal programs which are already have a tendency towards that?
Mr. Dykeman, you have a
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at, our estimates suggest we've done a review of the city municipal budgets at stake in Ontario alone, and our estimates suggest that if the region of Waterloo, we're talking about the whole region, if they are subject to closed bidding, that'll be almost $942 million at stake. So I think that is a big problem. That's just in the province of Ontario. That doesn't include some of the Red River projects that are going on the floodways, which has taken $324 million of federal funding alone, right? So that $942 million number is from all the cost of the projects themselves. But the federal government is investing hundreds of millions of dollars in these projects. Some of these projects are being some Canadians are being barred from working on these projects because of their private choices. And that's simply not fair. It's not fair. It doesn't provide good value for taxpayers' dollars. So if you have a situation where it's not fair, it's not providing any value to the taxpayer, I'm not sure why it should proceed. The status quo should be continued.
Why is that, Mr. Buda? Why is that continuing?
Well, as I said, I mean, the several anecdotal examples have been raised, and I don't have the information because we're not experts in tendering. Again, I mean, we're a national organization. We represent municipalities from across.
Municipalities acting in this kind of reckless manner with taxpayer money. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Mark.
Okay.
Go ahead and answer.
Sure. Well, I think I'd hesitate to describe it as reckless, since I believe that closed tendering is employed by other orders of government, including the federal government. I think there's lots of reasons for closed tendering. The City of Montreal has one example. Provincial regulations are certainly play a pretty big role. As I said, these provincial regulations were enacted in the late 80s. So there are many reasons to do this. I think some of the reasons are definitely no longer, I think as Mr. Dyke suggests, are no longer valid, and they need to be reviewed. My point is, I'm not sure that in every case federal regulation is the most efficient way of doing that. And I think one of Mr. Dykeman's recommendations was the federal government work with provinces to ensure that provincial procurement rules ensure that federal infrastructure dollars are invested as efficiently as possible. That to me feels like a lot more flexible and targeted approach than a one-size-fits-all federal regulation. So I'm not suggesting that FCM is in favor of rules that are going to drive up costs. I think that's a leap of logic that isn't necessarily borne out by quantitative evidence, which there doesn't seem to be a lot of.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Aubin. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bienvenue, merci d'être avec nous.
Thank you for being here. My first question is for Mr. Muda. For a couple of months, we've heard now that municipalities have never received as much money from the federal government. That may be true, but my real question is, do these increased amounts of federal funding, have they been accompanied by new responsibilities for the municipalities so that they would have the same type of deficit? Or in another way, has the amount gotten worse in the relationship with the amount of money that you have and the work that has to be done?
Yes, certainly. The needs facing municipalities on infrastructure in particular have grown, both through things that are outside of anyone's control, things like the need to adapt to a changing climate, and that's just a reality municipalities face. But there's other things like there's new federal wastewater regulations that obviously, municipalities, welcome any requirement to improve the quality of our natural water bodies, but at the same time come with very significant costs, $20 to $40 billion. These are new costs that are added on top of the already significant costs of 30 years, as I said earlier, of disinvestment by all orders of government. So, again, this speaks to Mr. Poilievre's point. Municipalities may well be spending more on infrastructure, partly because they haven't been spending enough for the last 30 years, but partly because there are significant new costs. And this doesn't include non-capital costs that are increasing because of downloading from other orders of government, whether it be provincial downloads of, for instance, housing responsibilities in some provinces, or indirect federal downloads like reductions in federal policing, which requires municipalities to undertake border patrols in the Great Lakes. These are costs that aren't traditionally meant to be borne by property tax-based municipalities, but nevertheless are. And so we believe that we need that it's those kind of areas where we're also working with the federal government to solve, and in fact we're working very productively in some areas. But it definitely drives up costs. And it makes it more difficult for municipalities to invest the kinds of both money and energy in ensuring that our infrastructure is there for the entire economy.
Merci beaucoup. Ma prochaine question sera pour...
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Buda. This afternoon, I received the Cardis study. So there are a number of points that caught my attention. First of all, when you said the current study is the first of a series of broader studies, how many of them are they, and will they be published? And could you quickly tell me what methodology was used for these studies to see how credible they are?
So there are a number of other studies. One, the closed tendering issue also affects school boards in Ontario. This one was a provincial focus, so school boards. And it also affects major energy producers and so on. So we are going to be looking at that. Those should be released in this year. As far as the methodology is concerned, this paper in particular was a survey of the estimates available from a variety of sources. And so you'll note we cited the City of Toronto study. We cited the building trades who cite the City of Toronto study. We looked at the City of Hamilton study and a number of others. None of them have showed anything but increases, and so that's a concern. Obviously, we applied that, and as far as looking for the amount of funds that are subject to that, as noted in our paper, we reviewed various budgets. And I don't want to get too technical here, but the labor law suggests that certain projects would fall under those closed tendering practices, and certain things wouldn't. So we reviewed line by line the city budgets, and that's how we came up with our total.
Mais depuis qu'on a débuté cette étude, on entend...
Since we've started our study, we've been hearing about the same figures about the costs of competition. If there are no open tenders, there's an increase in costs from between 2 to 40%, and that's certainly quite a large figure. And particularly since on page 16 of your report, you're saying there's no empirical data. So you could say that none of these estimates can be considered scientific, and none of the calculations have been published. So we have no empirical study that would allow us to say that this increases costs up to 40% or costs between 2 and 40%. It would seem to me that we would need to have a more thorough explanation.
We are actually hoping to undertake such a study. What is needed is a counterfactual, of course, and I don't want to get into scholarly debate in this. But what's key to note is there are two things at play here. One is that the estimates, the City of Hamilton estimate, which was 40%, for instance, is based on comparing the number of bids that it used to receive for a similar project and other ones. So it's not a perfect counterfactual study that would gain peer review, but neither is it a study that we can just ignore, because it's the city that actually has to pay for this work at the end of the day. The cost increase on their water treatment plant, for instance, came 83% over budget as a result of this. So I don't think it's simply a matter. It's not the standard is not what we would like it to see as a think tank, but I don't think we can ignore that. The preponderance of evidence suggests it's over. Second point is that if you're looking for value, I think the question of justice and whether this is a question of justice for all Canadians actually matters in this case. Why is it? Why is it that a taxpayer who chooses to join the CEP or another affiliated or another alternative union, or decides that he or she would prefer not to be unionized, why should they be disqualified? I've not yet heard a good response to that. So there are two. There are the economic issues, and then there's the democratic issues. I think the two are married.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Poilievre, 5 minutes.
Looking at the page 11, Mr. Dykema, of your report, it says here, figure 6, percentage of taxpayers in restricted municipalities, 62%. So that means that's the population, the combined population of Toronto, Hamilton, Kitchener, and Sault Ste. Marie?
Sault Ste. Marie. So
Sault Ste. Marie,
if that's been updated now in the case of, if you'd like me to answer.
Yes, go ahead.
So if without Waterloo, if Waterloo remains open as it currently is, its case is in front of the OLRB, without Waterloo, 26% of Ontarians, and I think that's about 11% of all Canadians, because Ontario is so populous, 11% of all Canadians are subject, taxpayers are subject to closed bidding. So it's the 26% number there. In all Ontario municipalities, 26% are subject to closed bidding. If Waterloo becomes subject to closed bidding, that's 28%. That's a quarter of Ontario's population. That's over 10% of the country's population. That's a big chunk of taxpayers.
And sorry, it becomes 38. Sorry, I see 3862. What does that number refer to?
But you mentioned CETA, and I know that the City of Toronto is very worried about CETA in that it may prevent them from having these local hiring policies, which would in fact force them to take that their own infrastructure money and spend it somewhere else, even though it doesn't make economic sense for the city. Can you comment on that?
Sure. FCM developed 7 principles to help guide the federal government's negotiations with the European Union to ensure that the subnational procurement provisions of CETA treated municipal procurement as fairly and as reasonably as possible. And so one of those provisions, for instance, was that that there should be an allowance for exempting certain strategic or regionally important sectors from that particular rule. And indeed, most provinces are forwarding to the federal government sectors that they believe are of regional significance or strategic importance. And I mean, the reports, because all of the negotiations are secret, are that the province of Ontario would be certainly seeking to exempt its transit industry from the provisions of CETA. So that would, our principles are designed to protect municipal accountability and responsibility for procurement in a fair and reasonable manner, understanding that freer trade will also benefit all communities as well. So we're trying to seek a balance there, and thus far the Minister of International Trade has been fairly firm that he believes that our principles are in fact fair and reasonable, and he intends to adhere to them. So thus far we're pretty happy with the progress, but of course the final agreement will tell the tale.
I have a question for Mr. Dykema. there are certain sectors of our economy that I, as a private citizen, can't get involved in, even though it's publicly funded. And what you're advocating, and others before you have advocated, is that if the public funds it, anybody should be able to do it, essentially. But I'm thinking of things like the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal in Ontario. Unless I'm called to the bar and spent $200,000 to get my union ticket to be a lawyer, I can't appear there. I am barred. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, that is actually not what I said. What I said was that, but I appreciate the question. What I said was that those who are qualified should not be disqualified because of their private choices. So ostensibly, certain companies that are otherwise qualified to do the work, and in fact do the work, a municipal line away or in a different province or what have you, are disqualified because of the choices that their workers make. And so we're not actually advocating for Brian Dykema Inc., who has two guys who've never plumbed before to set up the water treatment plant. But what I'm saying is that if you're a qualified contractor, if your workers are qualified to do the work, you should not be disqualified because of the choice that your workers make.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. And Mr. Watson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing today on what I think is an important study, and that's how we can ensure or how competition can make infrastructure dollars go further. Obviously, various levels of government deal with the reality that resources, that being tax revenues, are not unlimited. Taxpayers expect value for the hard-earned money that they pay out in taxes, whether it's a property tax, whether it's income taxes, provincial or federal. So I think this is a valuable study for us to be undertaken. Mr. Buda, I want to ask, you've been critical, if I fairly summarize your position, of any requirement, say in a federal provincial agreement on infrastructure, that would stipulate that there must be open tendering, if you will, for infrastructure projects. In fact, you've said that such a requirement would increase costs by an undefined amount, I guess, on municipalities. Do you have any sense of what it costs municipalities in Nova Scotia, for example, to comply with that? I understand that the Canada-Nova Scotia agreement, in effect since 2007, stipulates, and I'll quote it, says the contract award process will be competitive, fair, and transparent. That rules out not only sole source contracts, but union-only processes. Do you have a sense of what it costs municipalities there?
No, I don't. I think I wouldn't characterize my analysis as critical. I think I'd counsel caution that a one-size-fits-all national approach to this might end up it'll end up costing everyone more money and instead of maximizing benefits. So a province-by-province approach is certainly something that we would advocate, primarily because procurement falls within provincial procurement regulation and oversight falls within provincial jurisdiction. So, for instance, I think the example you bring up in Nova Scotia is a perfect example of where, in fact, our understanding is it was the province alongside the federal government that was actually mainly interested in using this agreement to continue its own efforts to do exactly what it was doing. So a province-by-province, territory-by-territory approach is going to allow the kind of flexibility and context sensitivity to ensure that the new regulations are as streamlined as possible. So all I'm counseling is caution that a one-size-fits-all regulation at the national level might end up costing more than it needs to.
But you have no idea what it would cost. I'm not sure it's fair to suggest that it's going to increase costs without being able to demonstrate that in fact it does increase costs. I mean, you've made the point, sure. I think, in contrast to Mr. Dykema, for example, that that maybe his numbers are wrong, or you've taken issues with some of his numbers, but at least he's come to the table with something that represents a range of potential increased costs relative to a close competition. I don't think it's fair to come to the committee and suggest it will increase costs to make this a core element of how we negotiate infrastructure agreements.
Well, I'd certainly expect Infrastructure Canada to be able to demonstrate that the cost of complying with any regulation, not just this one, outweighs the benefits that that regulation will bring, and that's all I'm suggesting.
You said it was overkill. That's pretty strong language, Mr. Buda. I would expect you to back that up with some numbers.
I'm suggesting, I'm counseling caution so that that doesn't end up being the case. But federal application-based funding programs, some of the approval processes can reach 3 or 4 years. That is a very real cost to capital. Every day that public funds sit in Ottawa rather than being invested in economically productive infrastructure, produces an opportunity cost. But you're right, I certainly don't have empirical evidence other than to point to the $6 billion in reprofiled money because of, in part because of extensive approval processes.
I'm merely pointing out you used the word overkill today, not me. Mr. Dykema, your report to the committee, were this to become a core part of the negotiating strategy of the federal government with respect to the provinces. In Ontario, for example, that processes be open and fair, and to insist on that as a condition of an infrastructure agreement. How many municipalities would have to worry about something like that? What percentage of municipalities would have to worry about whether or not they're captured under such a new system, if you will, of open competition?
Again, so yes, thanks very much for that. I would say this transcends issues of municipal politics as well. I'd like just to note that again, that there are major energy and other infrastructure projects that the federal government funds, but
municipalities, because your report focuses on municipalities.
No, and I'm just repeating my point. There are. In terms of a percentage, what percentage of municipalities would be affected? It's a very small percentage of municipalities if you're looking just in terms of the number.
About 91%, I think, according to yours, say that they don't have to worry at all about this because they're already open competition.
Fair enough, but as I noted earlier, if Waterloo goes forward, that's 28% of Ontario taxpayers. So
municipalities in your
You're actually well out of time if we just let them finish. Okay.
Yeah, so. You're right, 4 municipalities, but Toronto, Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, and the region of Waterloo are very populous municipalities, and they're also centers of industrial and other economic action, and therefore very strategic and important.
Okay, thank you. Now move to Ms. Chow for 5 minutes.
Yep. Can I go back to where we left off, Mr. Buda? On the gas tax formula, funding formula. You prefer gas tax partially because it's predictable, long-term, and it's direct, and you don't have to get bogged down with all the red tapes, the application forms, and the administrative trivia. The problem with some of the P3 screenings and the rest is there are rural municipalities that feels that if there is a block grant, often they get left out in the cold. In your negotiation, in your next round of negotiation, are you looking to pull a block of money to protect it so that the rural municipalities would have some form of assurance that their projects would be accepted, especially the water treatment programs that they so desperately need? Is that an area that FCM is focusing on?
For sure. So our submission to Mr. LaBelle as part of his